Vicky Taylor saw the long shadow cast across the rutted lane by the late afternoon sun, and froze. Her heart felt as though it were trying to smash through her ribcage. She kept perfectly still, and so did the shadow. The cosy, familiar surroundings of the West Sussex countryside that she had known all her life underwent a profound change. The sunlight, reflected from the puddles left by the storm of 3 nights ago, became a harsh, unnatural glare, and the chatter of birds in the hedgerows died away. A man stood, hidden by the girth of an old oak, some 20 metres ahead. Supposing there really had been a UFO that had landed during Tuesday night's storm, several people claimed to have seen something dropping from the sky. A sharp downward push on the palm of her artificial left hand caused its articulated fingers to tighten their grip on the handlebars of her bike. She backed away without taking her eyes off the strange shadow. 10 paces. 20 paces. A new distant sound caused the ground to shake with a primeval, savage beat, a sound she had never heard before in her 15 years, and yet she knew what it was. 500 warriors beating their assegais on their ox-hide shields and stamping, one beat for every spirit being avenged by the war party. How do I know this? The rich storm-soaked colours of the English countryside swam around her. The northern slopes of the South Downs dissolved into a vista of yellowing elephant grass and red soil. She concentrated on placing one foot before the other, eyes fixed straight ahead to where the owner of the shadow would soon come into view. And then the warrior was before her. It was a face that she knew. The man made flesh. The liquid eyes watching her were neither threatening nor welcoming. Apart from the craned feather headdress, he was naked. The long pointed shield that he held in front of him was covered in the finest leopard skin, the broad blade of his assegai sandstone polished. Vicky reached up on tiptoe and touched his chin. He made no move. She traced the line of his forehead and drew her fingertip down the bridge of his nose. She moved closer and realized with a distant shock that she had feeling through the prosthetic fingertips of her left hand. Panic seized her. He was fading. She reached forward to embrace him, but it was too late. A shimmering outline that blended with the distant hills, and he was gone. The sun went in, and the blinding glare on the yellow bush was no more. The elephant grass took on the brilliant greens of spring, and she found herself staring south towards the hills. Her left hand took on its customary leaden weight. Behind her an approaching diesel engine slowed to a tick-over. An old-fashioned bulb horn sounded. David Weir leaned out of the cab of his antique tractor and grinned down at her. 5 years previously he had sold his share in a Westminster art gallery and bought the run-down Temple Farm. Another gentleman farmer, said the locals. He turned the farm into a living rural museum, a source of friction between himself and some fellow councillors on Pentworth Council. "Hello, Vicky." Vicky gripped the handlebars tightly with her good hand to control her trembling. He leaned forward to study her left hand. "Is that the new one? Amazing. You never know." The tractor rumbled off, splashing through storm puddles. Vicky started walking. Something made a noise behind her, and she turned, catching a fleeting glimpse of a multi-legged shadow darting under a hedge. "Oh, God, I am seeing things today." 10 minutes later, deep in thought and unaware that she was being followed by the strange device, she arrived home. The crab-like machine took cover under a hedge and completed its transmission of data. "Mind my floor," Anne Taylor called as her daughter trailed in. "Phone call from your father just now. He's flown back to Riyadh. Won't be home for another week. Oh, and a call from Ellen Duncan. She wondered if you could start work an hour early in the shop tomorrow morning." Vicky climbed the stairs. Liquid eyes greeted her as she entered the sanctuary of her bedroom. A huge life-size poster of a Zulu warrior occupied the wall space at the foot of her bed. She sat and cupped her chin on her hand, returning the warrior's gaze. Arnie Trinder and Neville Rigsby were having a bad day. The radio communications agency investigators were wet, cold, tired, and about as miserable as two men who had spent 5 hours falling about a storm-drenched landscape could possibly be. Trinder's right shoulder was weighed down by a portable Jensen spectrum analyzer. Hanging from his other shoulder was a field computer, loaded with maps of the Pentworth area. "This'll do," he said, looking around for a dry spot to unload his gear, and seeing nothing but the broad expanse of Pentworth Lake. Rigsby switched on his AOR scanner and punched the airband key. The scanner howled, fading only slightly when he pointed it away from the swamp. A telephone in Trinder's pocket trilled. "So, what's the latest?" Townsend demanded from the warmth of his Southampton office. "It's definitely Pentworth Lake, George. The locals call it the Plague Swamp. We've got 3 bearings from the entire area, and they all point to the centre of the lake. What about the landowner? Maybe he knows something." "Ellen Duncan, local councillor. Runs a herbalist's in North Street. Doesn't sound a likely bug planter." "Well, some clever sods planted one." "It's not a bug, George. This is something seriously large, if it's been transmitting for a day." Townsend snapped. "Just find it. It's messing up aircraft DME in the Pentworth Quadrant. I promised it'll be located and disabled by nightfall." Rigsby surveyed Pentworth Lake. "Maybe there's an aerial in that clump of reeds. Come on." He took several glugging steps and sank up to his knees. He tried to lift his leg, but transferring his weight caused him to sink even deeper. Trinder squelched in a semicircle to grab his colleague's outstretched hand. He too sank, feet pumping frantically in the glutinous ooze. Trinder released the spectrum analyzer's buckle and swung the heavy instrument by its strap, but the recoil from his exertion quickened his sinking. Rigsby's fingers fought blindly through the cold and mud to release the buckle of his haversack. Suddenly what little support the ooze provided was gone, and he was up to his neck. Trinder grabbed Rigsby's collar, pushing his colleague's head above the surface as his own went under. Trinder gained the surface, choked, gagged, and went under again, taking Rigsby with him. The swamp closed over the two men. It was the hiss of a snake that woke Ellen Duncan. She lay perfectly still, listening intently. There it was again. A sustained hiss. Too long for a snake's. The noise stopped. She stared up at the yellow glow of North Street's lights suffusing the ceiling of her bedroom. There it was again, this time followed by a metallic rattling. She crossed to the window and threw up the sash. 2 youths, swathed from head to foot in black, ran off soundlessly in opposite directions and were gone by the time Ellen dashed barefoot into the street. A man emerged. He was wearing a white tracksuit and white trainers, his figure picked out in stripes of orange and yellow reflective tape. Sergeant Mike Malone joined Ellen in the middle of the street. "I was about to nab them when you frightened them off." "At least they didn't manage to break in." "They weren't trying to." Ellen turned to look at her shop front. Earth Force was sign written in a semicircle on each window, and inside each arc was Ellen Duncan, herbalist. Below, in the stylishly ugly overlapping font favoured by graffiti artists, was EX2218. For an instant, Ellen's face contorted, and Malone caught her as her legs buckled. "Delayed reaction," he said cheerfully, pushing the shop's side door open with his hip. The combined aroma of hundreds of herbs assailed him as he lowered her into a chair. She rewarded him with a smile, but the fear that he had seen in her eyes was still there. Following her directions, Malone made 2 mugs of curiously scented tea. Ellen closed her eyes and allowed the root decoction to go to work on her nervous system. The sergeant looked around the workroom. Hanging alongside the racks of tools and shelves piled high with booklets, there were glossy photos showing Ellen and David Weir at their Paleolithic dig, the discovery the previous year of a 40,000-year-old flint mine camp on Ellen Duncan's land had been a local sensation. "I suppose the number must be a tag," said Malone, watching Ellen carefully. She opened her eyes. "Yes, of course. A tag. Any more news about the men who disappeared in my lake this afternoon?" "Still no sign when I left the station. They were from the Radio Communications Agency in Southampton, investigating a source of radio transmissions interfering with the aircraft beacon at Midhurst." "Broadcasting from the middle of my lake?" Malone shrugged and took another sip of the potent tea. "The transmissions stopped just after the men disappeared. They'll reappear. Even if they've been sucked into the quicksand. There's no such thing as quicksand, Mr. Malone. There's sand and there's water. Mix them together in roughly equal proportions, and you have what people call quicksand. You can float in it. You can even swim in it. But it takes some doing." "You should have that bog fenced off." "The common is stitched up with covenants. The land I don't need for my herbs, I rent to David Weir for his sheep." "Your Stone Age find is fenced. Chain link and razor wire." "I know. I hate it. But it was that or souvenir hunters stripping the site. Certainly was a lucky find." "I'm fine now, Mr. Malone, and I ought to get some sleep." He accepted the dismissal. They made an arrangement to meet at 10 the following morning at the lake and exchanged good nights. Sergeant Malone loped quickly and silently along the hushed streets. The strange tea had spiked his exhaustion, and he felt he could face anything. Even the self-styled Divine Sentinel, Father Adrian Roscoe, founder and leader of the Bodian Brethren and Lord of Pentworth Manor. The forbidding presence of the 5-metre-high wall that Malone now skirted gave Pentworth the brooding atmosphere of a prison town. Pentworth Manor was a late 18th-century pile with 400 acres of deer park and farmland. In the 10 years since Adrian Roscoe had taken over, he'd revitalised the estate, adding a dairy and a bakery. Malone approached the front entrance. Heat-activated security lights bathed him, and a CCTV camera whined softly in the stillness. Among Malone's many responsibilities was a requirement to keep a watching brief on Adrian Roscoe and his followers. "Good evening," said a voice from the speaker grill. "I'm Helen, tonight's duty sentinel." Malone held his warrant card up to the camera, and a solenoid lock on a side door buzzed. He was shown into a small office where the sentinel sat behind a desk. An array of closed-circuit monitors faced her. On the wall hung a picture of the 18th-century astronomer, Johann Bode. "How can we help you, officer?" "There's been an incident of vandalism in North Street. I wondered if you'd seen anything." Malone noticed that she had moved her left hand to her lap. An alarm button was wired to Roscoe's bedroom. Malone had advised on its position during his time as crime prevention officer. "I believe a couple of your inmates were roaming the town." "No one has been out of the house tonight. I would have seen them." "Good evening, Mr. Roscoe." Malone turned to confront the gaunt, white-gowned presence, who smiled engagingly at the police officer. "Our brother and sister sentinels are not inmates, Sergeant Malone. We are a happy kibbutzim community." The rich, resonant voice was famous from 1,000 American TV commercials. There was a genuine friendliness in the whole demeanour of the multimillionaire. Even the ultraviolet eyes conveyed warmth. Malone outlined the incident in North Street. "Ellen Duncan? The herbalist? And you saw 2 men outside this woman's shop? What made you think they were from here?" "They used teamwork. Not your average Pentworth yobs." "And yet they indulged in mindless vandalism." "Maybe it wasn't mindless. Any idea what EX2218 means?" Roscoe gave the question several moments' thought. I'm afraid not, Sergeant. Of course it's possible that the two men you saw were more recent novitiates. We rescue many from the streets of Brighton and Littlehampton. Drug addicts, beggars, dropouts. But it takes a while for some of them to shake off their ungodly ways. If you say you've actually seen them, then you'd better come and pick them out. Roscoe always cooperated 100% with the police. He led Malone across the main hall, passed a security card through a swipe reader, and opened the double oak-panelled doors to what had once been the banqueting hall. The northern end was almost completely hidden by a giant flower-garlanded portrait of Johann Bode, lights illuminating his venerable features in a milky, ethereal glow. But the centrepiece of the solar temple was the floor, quite black, onto which an overhead projector threw images of the planets orbiting the sun. Jupiter, its red spot glowing like a baleful eye, Mars, a ruptured map of rills and volcanoes, Venus, a featureless haze of light, Earth, a blue-green iridescent disk, swathed in the spirals of its weather systems. The asteroid belt lying between Mars and Jupiter was depicted as a sparkling ring of glittering points of light. It was like being inside a giant, luminous orrery. Outside the orbit of Pluto, a circle of 10 white-gowned figures knelt at prayer, one for each of the planets. The Bodians believed the asteroid belt to be the remnants of the 5th planet from the Sun, a planet which had aroused the wrath of God, so he had destroyed it and all its peoples. According to Roscoe, his followers must pray for the salvation of these souls and beseech God not to exact the same retribution upon this sin-racked earth. The sentinels were perfectly still, hands folded in laps, cowls pushed back, heads bowed in silent meditation. "Help yourself," Roscoe invited. "Walk around the outside, but please don't go inside the circle. Each sentinel has focused his or her entire consciousness on their assigned planet. A break in their concentration, even for a second, could be disastrous." Malone walked slowly around the outside of the circle until he caught a faint whiff of acrylic paint. He stared down at the nearest youth. The brilliant glow of the sun's image in the centre of the circle highlighted tiny beads of sweat on his temple. The white sole edging of a trainer poked out from under the gown of another youth to his left. Malone touched each one on the shoulder for a couple of seconds, then returned to Roscoe's side. Malone was crossing the dark courtyard of Pentworth Manor when the main gate swung open and he was blinded by the lights of a giant Winnebago camper. Malone caught a glimpse of Nelson Faraday at the wheel. He was an unlikely lieutenant for Father Adrian Roscoe, but if you want to get the measure of a man, take a look at his friends. Faraday was 35, very tall, dress sense as sharp as a spiv. He hadn't pimped or beaten up a prostitute in 10 years, so according to the Spent Convictions Act, he was clean. The big white van, emblazoned with a logo that showed a divine mailed fist smashing a planet, was Roscoe's mobile temple, to take the word to the masses. Inside the camper were hot showers, warm beds, and a galley that doled out junk food. While the young and hungry queued, they would be regaled by a video of clips from recent big-budget science-fiction movies, interspersed with an unblinking Roscoe preaching the message of his Bodian brethren. He told a story of how great civilizations across the galaxy had abandoned God and become locked in a series of terrible battles. Even the angels fled in panic from the mighty star-roaming cruisers piloted by demons and witches. One civilization, living on what was then the 5th planet from the Sun, had come to believe that their collective entity was God, until God himself, after many unheeded warnings, struck them down, smashing their planet into thousands of asteroids. Mankind, Roscoe declared, raising his fists above his head, was embarking on the same disastrous course. But God had given them a warning, revealing the fate of the fifth planet to the astronomer, Johann Bode. Roscoe's message had everything: science, Star Wars, astronomy, astrology, and an almost total absence of any complex theology or doctrine. It was an easily understood cult. He demanded nothing from his followers but prayer for the salvation of others and the rejection of Satan and his witches. Mantra-like, he repeated the phrase, "Purity of prayer is more important than purity of body." New recruits soon found that the Brethren's way of life did not extend to rejecting the sins of the flesh. The gate swung shut behind Malone, and he broke into a jog. A watcher followed the figure's long, easy strides along the darkened streets. It was the crab-like device that had followed Vicky the previous afternoon. It moved in silent pursuit, unaware that it was not the only watcher. Kathy Price, sitting in her bedroom at the top of Hill House, was keeping Pentworth under close observation. At the age of 10, she had been thrown from her pony, and the parts of her brain designed to maintain balance had been permanently damaged. Months of physiotherapy had failed to restore this function, but at 32 she was mentally and physically fit. Hours of each day were given over to exercise, so scared was she that her body might atrophy. She had inherited Hill House from her mother, and it afforded her uninterrupted views of Pentworth and the surrounding countryside. At night she sat in her wheelchair, gazing through the telescope she had mounted on it. The lights in the town seemed fractionally dimmer tonight. One spilled from the workshop observatory at the back of Bob Harding's shop. A few glimmered to the south. The police were keeping watch over the old plague swamp, where 2 men had disappeared the day before. Kathy roved the eyepiece. She caught sight of Sergeant Malone. Then a blur of movement following behind. She focused on the moving shadow. It gave the impression of a crab or spider. Malone slowed, and so did the creature. She counted 8 legs, possibly more. They had a metallic look about them. The spider's outline softened as the man resumed his homeward jog. Malone stopped abruptly and spun round, his eyes probing the hedgerows, his breathing shallow. There it was again, a faint scrabbling sound. He called out in a friendly, coaxing voice, but no animal emerged. He headed up the lane to a cutting where the banks on either side were buttressed by steep retaining walls. His ears picked up the scratching once again, and without warning Malone wheeled round and charged. He was within 3 strides of the creature when its shell snapped open into segments that started to spin like the rotors of a helicopter. Malone threw himself forward, hands outstretched, and his clutching fingers closed on nothing. The spider climbed into the sky, so fast that it had vanished before Malone had time to focus. Ellen Duncan woke 2 hours before dawn. The sinister graffiti sprayed on her shop window had been nagging and gnawing when she fell asleep, and it was there again when she woke. She consoled herself that Sergeant Malone hadn't known the true meaning of EX 2218. But someone else might. She pulled on her dressing gown and rummaged under the kitchen sink for paint. Several strokes across the odious message were enough to obliterate it. Feeling better, she made herself a cup of tea and padded into her tiny living room. Often she would sit facing the window, looking out onto the slopes leading down to Pentworth Lake. Ellen would try to picture the land before her as it would have been 40,000 years ago, at the end of the last great ice age. The desiccating winds blowing off the northern ice sheet would have made it impossible for the pre-ice age forests to re-establish, except in pockets and valleys. But during the warming period, sedges and grasses would have flourished, supporting vast herds of game: bison, antelope, giant reindeer-like megaloceros, fleet-footed horses preyed upon by cave lions and saber-toothed tigers, and largest of them all, the mighty woolly mammoth. Into this harsh world had come a tiny handful of people. Cro-Magnon, the triumphant throw of the evolutionary dice. Where they came from was unknown. Taller and lighter than their Neanderthal contemporaries, their bodies were not so well adapted for survival. They were, however, better equipped in one respect. They had imagination. Cro-Magnon man experimented and innovated. The Cro-Magnons had learned how to cure skins and had invented thong stitching so that they could make warm, close-fitting clothes. These enabled them to follow the great herds north as the mighty ice cap retreated. The Neanderthalers had merely wrapped and knotted themselves in furs as best they could. To them, the ice was the great enemy. To Cro-Magnon man, it was an ally. The lack of caves on the broad steppes was a problem for the Neanderthalers. They had to follow the herds, yet without shelter they perished. The Cro-Magnons solved the problem by building their own shelter. They set up teepee-like circles of mammoth tusks and covered them with hide. Sunk into the ground and covered with earth, their homes were protected from the glacial chilled blast of the winter wind. Supplies were stored out of doors in food caches, protected against scavengers under huge rock cairns. The remains of one such cache had been discovered in deep mud at Ellen's dig. She had dug artifacts out of the ground with her bare hands, had held a flint knife, long and delicate, so thin that the light shone through its edge. But flint tools were common. What Ellen craved was the one discovery that eluded British paleontologists: art. There had been no discoveries in the British Isles to equal the magnificent cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet in France. Ellen longed for a time machine, to be transported back to meet Cro-Magnon man, those strange ancestors. She wanted to experience the moment when they realized that what they saw before them in the sunlight could be carried in their minds and reproduced on cave walls deep in the earth where the sun never shone. A flare of headlights across the fields caught Ellen's attention. A police vehicle was guarding the scene where the two men had disappeared. She knew the police stood little chance of finding the men, but she had agreed to help. A new search with scuba divers would start work at first light. She fell into a fitful sleep. The spider kept its flight as short as possible. It landed in a field, folded its rotors, and set off across the grass in the direction of the tailor's house. Of all the pupils that had streamed out of St. Catherine's the previous afternoon, Vicky Taylor had caught the interest of the spider's controllers. The rhythms emanating from her brain were of a particular richness, strength, and texture. In the visible light she appeared like all the others, yet the spider's spectrum showed that her body lacked essential symmetry. While amplifying Vicky's daydream into a strange reality, the spider had removed a tiny sample of blood and tissue from her leg, and it sat now beneath her window, monitoring the patterns of her sleep. A whip-like rod extended from its upper case, and tiny barbs caught the first-floor windowsill. Winding in the rod, the spider climbed the side of the house, arriving at the roof outside Vicky's window. Accelerating the aging of the glass until a designated section of it flowed like hot wax onto the sill, the spider entered the room. Vicky stirred and rolled onto her back, her handless left arm now draped above the creature. The spider's sensors scanned the girl, mapping her body, her makeup, her DNA. It examined the artificial hand lying in a box on the dresser. Then it placed a sensor above her head and started searching. Jack and Anne Taylor's first holiday in the 4 years since Vicky's birth had turned into a disaster. Delayed 8 hours at Gatwick, it was midnight before the courier dropped them, with an apologetic wave, outside the aging Spanish apartment block. Vicky started wailing. She was tired, hungry, longing for familiar surroundings. Anne scooped her up and carried her inside the lift, leaving Jack to drag the bags inside. Once inside the lift, they closed the outer doors and pressed the button for the 4th floor. As the lift started moving, Vicky screamed. Her hand was being dragged into the gap between the floor of the lift and the wall of the shaft. Jack struggled frantically with the unfamiliar controls and managed to stop the lift 2 meters above the ground. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of sounds. English voices in the lobby, Jack pleading with them above his daughter's screams not to move the lift. The sudden silence as Vicky fainted. Spanish voices, arguments, a crash overhead as a roof panel was ripped off, the crackle of cutting equipment slicing into the doors, ambulance sirens howling despite the time of night. 4 hours later, a doctor in the hospital at Dania told them that their daughter was out of danger, but that it had been too late to save her hand. The fleeting images dragged from Vicky's subconscious were enough. The spider began a program of analysis, isolating and replicating those parts of Vicky's genetic code that determined the configuration of the missing hand. Stem cell division stimulants were passed into Vicky's system, triggering dormant, self-replicating molecules. When the process was complete, the spider left the room, reversing the aging of the glass as it went. Vicky slept on, without stirring. Bob Harding was in sombre mood. A Fellow of the Royal Society, and the most overqualified electrical repairman in the country, he had given up a career as a government adviser to indulge his twin passions of astronomy and electronics. He had drifted into repair work, and the shop barely paid its way, but he had enough to live comfortably. He enjoyed his work, and his customers were his friends. In the early hours of the morning he was sitting in his workshop turning over the events of the previous afternoon in his mind. 2 inspectors from the Radio Communications Agency had visited him. They were trying to track down illegal transmissions emanating, they believed, from Pentworth Lake. Now the men were missing, presumably drowned. If only he had thought to suggest that they visit Ellen Duncan. She would have warned them of the dangers. After a bad storm like the one 4 nights ago, the area would have been transformed into a swamp. In the 12 hours since the men had disappeared, the signals too had gone. He switched on his VHF transceiver to check that the rogue transmissions hadn't started again. All was well. The data received was loud and clear. The inspectors must have been mistaken. The howl of white noise heard the previous day had been too powerful to come from anything but a large installation. He pulled a window blind aside and peered through the eyepiece of the great Newtonian telescope that he had built himself. A heavy film of condensation covered the primary mirror. Damn storm. No Jupiter watch tonight. He wondered what to do next. It was coming up to the hour. Time for the news, and maybe a mention of the 2 inspectors. He turned on the satellite television. Flashes of white light sparkled across the screen, a sure indication of a weak signal. He flicked through all the Astra analog channels. Signal strength was down on every one, and most of the digital channels were too weak for the picture to lock up. He switched to his steerable dish, and was astonished to discover that the signal from the Eutelstat Hotbird was also down by at least 5 decibels. Hotbird blasted a powerful signal across most of Europe. It had a solid footprint. Atmospheric pressure was extremely high, at 1030 millibars. That had to be a record, but it wouldn't account for the weak TV reception. He switched on his old Philips valve TV. It was the shrunken picture on the screen that fingered the problem. The transformer power supplies in old TVs could not compensate for reduced voltages like modern sets. He checked the mains voltage with a multimeter and called the power company. 200 volts? The duty engineer sounded astonished. You seem to have lost nearly 40 volts somewhere. Hold on, please, sir. Harding was on the point of hanging up when the engineer returned. "Pentworth is supplied through an unmanned substation, and the readings from there are as they should be. It must be a local problem. Perhaps storm damage that's only just shown up. We'll look into it." Harding locked the workshop and returned to the flat above the shop. As he filled the kettle to make coffee, he noticed that the water pressure was unusually low. First the electricity, now the water. He placed the kettle on the gas ring. An insipid flame spilled forth, yellowish blue and gutless. Hunger woke Vicky as the first flush of dawn stole across her bedroom ceiling. Phantom hands seemed to be tying her stomach into knots. She ran to the kitchen, still not fully awake. Ripping open a fresh loaf of bread, she crammed 2 slices into her mouth. She seized a carton of milk from the fridge and squeezed the contents down her throat. She felt a buzz of elation, so loud and insistent she could almost hear it. Her whole body was tingling. The insistent ringing of the doorbell woke Ellen from her sleep. She stumbled downstairs and opened the shop door. Vicky Taylor, green eyes beacon bright, had arrived for her Saturday job. "Are you all right, Miss Duncan?" "I'm far from all right," said Ellen sourly. She led Vicky into the workroom. "I have to go and see the police down at the lake about those 2 men." "What happened to the window?" "Vicky, darling, make the tea and don't let's talk." Water trickled slowly from the tap in the kitchen, and the kettle seemed to take an age to boil. Ellen disappeared upstairs to run a bath. She returned an hour later, dressed in donkey jacket and Wellingtons. "I need you to make up 20 packs of allergy treatment. I'll be back about noon. Call me on my mobile if there are any problems." Vicky nodded. "Miss Duncan, could any of the herbs or plants I'm handling affect me in some way?" "You're more likely to affect them. Why do you ask?" "This morning I woke up really early and I was starving hungry." "You're a growing girl." "And yesterday I had this kind of hallucination." "What do you mean?" Vicky related her strange encounter with the Zulu warrior. "Oh, Vicky, it was nothing. A daydream." "But I knew things about them, about the Zulus, that I'd never been taught. I looked them up when I got home, and I was right." "Then you must have looked them up before, or heard them on television, on the radio." Vicky shook her head. She seemed almost to be crying. "Was there something else?" "Please don't laugh at me, but there was something else. A crab. A mechanical crab on the path that moved like clockwork. Fast. It looked real." "Vicky, listen to me. You were tired, you were stressed. It was just your brain unwinding." Ellen smiled at her, and the girl smiled weakly back. Sergeant Malone was struggling to overtake the Southern Electric van, labouring up Duncton Hill. The smell of burning clutch plate liner filled the car. The van in front slowed to a crawl, black smoke pouring out of its exhaust. The driver waved him past, but it was no use. Malone couldn't nudge past 25. A strange resistance clawed at the car. It was like driving through shallow flooding. If it wasn't March, I'd think the road was melting. He was 3 miles from Pentworth when suddenly the car surged forward. Ellen Duncan picked her way through herbs and wild flowers, following the path from her shop down to Pentworth Lake. On the far side of the lake a police car was parked, and divers in wetsuits were busy manoeuvring an inflatable boat into the water. She passed the site of the flint mine dig, enclosed in chain wire fencing. They'd stopped the excavation work last November, and she worried that she and David Weir might struggle to find enough volunteers to start the project up again. She glanced up at the great sandstone scarp that stood at the eastern end of her land. The platform of rock protruding from the wooded hillside had been a favourite spot of Tennyson's. It was known locally as the Temple of the Winds. Rain and wind had carved a scowling face into the rock. A small crab-like creature followed her at a safe distance, keeping to the shadows and the undergrowth. Vicky dropped the bag she was holding and pushed her artificial hand more firmly onto her left wrist. The suction didn't seem to work, and she heard a hiss of air escape the seal. Removing the hand, she examined the skin underneath. Beneath the tough layers, a growth had formed, just 8 millimeters across, but enough to stop her hand fitting properly. She picked up the telephone and called Dr. Vaughan. When Millicent Vaughan arrived, she ushered Vicky into the back room and made an examination of the growth. The skin surrounding it looked new and healthy. She pressed the lump and watched it turn from white to pink. Whatever it was, the blood supply was flowing well around it. "I can feel you touching it. It tickles." Millicent pressed her fingers more firmly into the tip of the stump. She fancied she could feel 5 hard, tiny nodes beneath the surface of the skin. "To be honest, Vicky, I'm not sure what to think. It doesn't look malignant. The skin's too healthy. Come to the surgery on Monday evening. I need some time to consult with Dr. Reynolds. Don't go worrying now. It's probably harmless, just a little unwanted bone growth." Millicent Vaughan was lost in thought as she left Vicky to her work. As Ellen approached the lake, she noted with displeasure that Asquith Prescott had joined the group upon the shore. A wealthy local landowner, Prescott was chairman of the Pentworth Town Council, a council on which Ellen sat. Beneath his waistcoats and tweed suits, Prescott wore a thought-tight armour of vanity and guile that allowed for no view but his own. As Ellen joined them, he was deep in conversation with Inspector Harvey Evans, who turned to greet her with a sour expression. "Something's got to be done, Miss Duncan. The lake just isn't safe." "Well, it can't be fenced. The water's acid. Wooden posts would rot. Concrete ones would sink."
"It's designated an area of outstanding natural beauty,"
said Prescott. "An area of outstanding natural danger, more like." Evans turned as Mike Malone's car drew up beside them. "There's no sign of the missing men, Sergeant." He was interrupted by a shout from one of the divers as they struggled to the shore. "Sorry, Mr. Evans, but I just can't dive in that stuff. The whole thing's quicksand, and it just gets thicker and thicker as you go down." The diver started sponging silt from his wetsuit. "Just how deep is it, anyway?" "Well over 300 feet," said Ellen. "The lake's fed by subterranean springs. After heavy rain, you get an upwelling and the whole thing turns into a swamp, in which 2 men have drowned." "And they would have drowned more easily in clear water. Sand and water are thixotropic, Mr. Evans. The faster you move in them, the thicker they become. All you need to know is to make your upward movements slow and your downward movements fast, and you'll find what seemed a liquid turning solid beneath your feet."
"That's very interesting, but it doesn't solve our immediate problem," said Evans sourly, levering his stocky figure behind the wheel of his car. "Have you considered that position, Sergeant?" "I'm afraid I must respectfully decline. Sundays are the only time my ex allows me access to my kids." Evans grunted and drove off. Ellen turned to Malone. "I take it Evans wants you to join his Pentworth Morris men?" Malone shrugged and smiled. "If you ask me, Sergeant, that was not a politically astute refusal." The shop bell jangled, and Vicky found Nelson Faraday standing at the counter. "Can I speak to the woman that owns this place?" "I'm very sorry, sir, but Miss Duncan is unavailable. Can I take a message?" "Tell her that a cleaning company will be along on Monday to do her shop front." He smiled unexpectedly and held out his hand. "I'm Nelson Faraday." Vicky Taylor."
She had extended her right hand to shake his, and now Faraday was refusing to let go.
"We're having one of our weekend raves at the Manor, starting tonight. How old are you?"
Vicky paused. 15. He released her hand and laid a gilt-edged invitation on the counter.
"You'll need to look at least 18.
With that he smiled, turned on his heels and left without a backward glance. Vicky picked up the invitation and studied the barcode on the back. The parties held by the Bodian Brethren were well known in Pentworth, but locals rarely received an invitation, and certainly no one under 18. Ellen's near-sleepless night caught up with her as she was returning to the shop. She had passed the dig enclosure and was near the top of the bluff when her legs decided that enough was enough. She sank to the ground, the steep slope above Pentworth Lake as pleasant a place to rest as any. The sun was warm. High above, a skylark sang, riding a thermal of warm air rising from the Temple of the Winds. She spent a few moments indulging in her favourite pastime, imagining what the area must have looked like when Paleolithic miners were at work. Her eyes closed. The song of the skylark faded, and it was suddenly very hot. There was a strange roar of water above the incessant buzz of insects. She sat upright. In place of the soft contours of the Sussex Downs was a saw-toothed line of sharp escarpments and ragged tors. To the west was a broad, swift-flowing yellow river. The waters piled up against a sharp ravine and changed course, charging rapids, plunging into a crater-like chasm at least a kilometre across, where Pentworth Lake should have been. Timeless moments passed. Ellen knew she was asleep. She knew this was a dream. She didn't close her eyes or make a move, for fear that she would wake. Eddies of a strong north wind struck with icy coldness at her back, yet her chest was hot and sticky from the solar radiation. With the wind came a low moaning from behind her. She turned to gaze at the Temple of the Winds. The sandstone outcrop was far larger than it should have been, and the features of the scowling gargoyle were sharper and more pronounced. Standing on the slab plateau was a huge, trumpet-like structure. She took several steps up the slope. The dreamscape remained sharp and clear, providing a flood of details that no dream could ever match. This was a real world. She scrambled up the slope and reached the brow, the cold north wind burning her throat dry. How could the wind be so cold and yet the sun so hot? There was no humidity. Something was sucking moisture from her throat. Glaciers. To the north would lie mighty ice sheets, glaciers that sucked the wind dry and created these freeze-dried steppes. There was a zigzag track leading up to the temple. Not the rough, narrow path she was familiar with, but a hewn roadway, wide and clear. She raced up the steep, emerging breathless on the plateau. The horn-like structure was bigger than she'd realized. The framework of thong-lashed saplings stood nearly 3 times her height. It was mounted on 2 larger poles, with hewed ends in the manner of sledge-runners. The thing was intended to be movable. The horn itself was made of goat hides, beautifully worked and stitched together. It was cross-braced with small saplings to form what looked to Ellen like a gigantic foghorn. She stared into the contraption's gaping maw. The wind abated for a few moments, and she thought she heard voices coming from the horn. She moved back to get a clearer picture. The throat of the horn was connected to a duct made of long stretches of intestine, stretched over hoops of hazel. The ducting was the colour of sedge-grass, and the diameter of her thigh. There was only one animal large enough to provide such a thing, the woolly mammoth. And then the purpose of the horn struck her. A ventilator. A giant scoop to catch the wind and take it... where? Hardly able to contain her excitement, Ellen set off down the track. She kept close alongside the snaking duct. Suddenly, there before her was something she had hardly dared hope for. A cave. Smoke was eddying from the opening into which the ducting disappeared. Ellen froze as the figure of a man emerged from the smoke. They stared at each other in mutual astonishment. Slightly built, the man was naked, apart from a hide breechclout. His arms were streaked with dyes, and red ochre was caked into his hair and beard. His eyes were brown and wide-set, and around his neck hung a curved tooth on a thong. Ellen held her hands out to show that they were empty, and took a step towards him. Fear clouded his gaze. He muttered something, clutched the tooth, and backed away from her. "Please," said Ellen, "I won't hurt you." Her words decided the man. He uttered a cry and disappeared into the smoke. She made to follow him, but was driven back, coughing and sputtering, by the dense white clouds of wood smoke that came billowing from the cave. The smoke scalded her throat and eyes, and she fell to her knees, blinded, frantically waving her arms in an attempt to drive back the suffocating cloud. A southwesterly wind blew the smoke clear. She could hear the song of the skylark and the shrill scream of a distant chainsaw. She opened her eyes, and everything was as it should be. The stream, the glitter of Pentworth Lake, a ribbon of traffic far to the south on the Chichester Road. The land around her had lost the angular harshness of her vision. She knew she had to pinpoint the exact position of the cave's entrance. She searched the bank for a clue, a discoloration of the grass, but there was nothing. All she had to go on was instinct. She knelt and made a small marker cairn of pebbles before she left the spot. She pulled her telephone from her pocket. The bar graph showed an abnormally weak signal. She called David Weir. What was she to say? That she had been transported back 40,000 years, in a dream so vivid that it had to be real? She recalled the advice she had given to Vicky. Perhaps this weird experience had sprung from something that she had read. The phone seemed unable to make a connection. She tried again. "David, it's Ellen. I'm just above the dig. Get the mini-digger and Charlie and a few of the lads up here, ASAP. What have you found now? The reception started to break up. David, please. 30 minutes. I'm on my way. Ellen took the shortest route up the slope to home. It had to be a daydream. She had spent so many hours trying to visualize what the valley had been like 40,000 years before. 40,000 years. Think about that, Ellen. The whole of recorded history yet to be written. And you think you heard the voices of the people of that time? She arrived home, having decided to phone David and call the whole thing off. Vicky heard the back door and came to meet her. "Are you all right, Miss Duncan?" Ellen's dark hair was awry, her face covered in sweat-stained smuts of soot. Vicky wrinkled her nose. "You stink of bonfire." "I do?" Ellen sniffed cautiously at her pullover. "Yes, I do. It must be in your hair, your clothes, everything." Vicky broke off as Ellen flung her arms around her. Then Ellen broke away and started rummaging in the drawers of the workroom. "Camera. Where did I put the digital camera? Middle left drawer. And those aerial photos Harvey Evans took last year? Box file." Ellen put the camera, the pictures, a torch and some drawing implements into a bag. "Vicky, can I ask a huge favour and ask you to mind the shop for another few hours? I can stay on till closing time." "You're an angel." And with that her employer was gone. Vicky sniffed her blouse where Ellen had hugged her. She detected the lingering smell of wood smoke from a fire that had been lit 40,000 years before. Mike Malone's wide-set eyes and penetrating gaze made Bob Harding feel decidedly uncomfortable. He shuffled some papers on the bench of his workshop. "I did a bit of digging as soon as I got your call, Mr. Malone. It was,
Johann Bode you wanted information on? Harding looked through his papers. Johann Eilert Bode, born Germany 1747, died 1826. A self-educated mathematical genius. Started publishing brilliant star catalogues in his early 20s. He gained an international reputation. Became the director of the Berlin Academy Observatory at 39. So, what's Bode's law? Well, it's not really a law, Mr. Malone. Not one that fits into any pattern of astrophysics. It's a shaky formula for predicting the distances of planets from the Sun. It's simple to understand. Must be if Adrian Roscoe has managed to sell it to all the deadbeats he's lured up to the manor. It starts with a simple string of numbers. 0, 3, 6, 12, 24, 48, and so on. You see the relationship? Each number is a doubling of the previous number? Exactly. Next, Bode added 4 to each number, so they became 4, 7, 10, 16, 28, 52, etc. And then he divided each number by 10. 0.4, 0.7, 1, 1.6, 2.8, 5.2, and so on and so forth. Bode believed that this last string of numbers represented the distance of each planet from the Sun in astronomical units. Now, an astronomical unit, or AU, is the distance of the Earth from the Sun, about 150 million kilometres. Now, look at this. Harding showed Malone a table listing the planets of the solar system. You see? Mercury's actual distance from the Sun is 0.39 AU. Bode's law predicted 0.4. Venus is 0.72 AU. Bode predicted 0.7. It goes on. Mars is 1.52 astronomical units from the Sun. Bode said 1.6. Jupiter is 5.2 AU, exactly where Bode said it would be. Of course, when Bode published his law, the scientific establishment tore him to shreds. A total arbitrary law governing the distance of the planets from the Sun didn't make sense, and still doesn't. Bode's law predicted a planet after Saturn at 19.6 AUs, and there wasn't one. Then, in 1781, Sir William Herschel discovered Uranus at a distance of 19 AUs from the Sun. Bode's enemies went into their corner and came out fighting. They pointed out that there wasn't a planet between Mars and Jupiter, which there should have been according to Bode's law. Then, in 1801, the first of thousands of asteroids were found in what is now known as the asteroid belt. The asteroid belt is 2.8 AUs from the Sun, the exact distance Bode predicted. The planet smashed by the wrath of God. If you believe men like Adrian Roscoe. He turns up at council meetings sometimes. Good talker. Hypnotic. Loony as a lemming. Malone toyed with his notebook. What do you believe, Mr. Harding? I'm an atheist. Like most scientists, I think that Bode's law is nothing more than a coincidence. The asteroid belt may have been a planet in the making that never made it. Harding showed Malone to the door. Any news on the electricity fault? The voltage is still down? I don't think so. Lots of Southern Electric vans rushing about. There is something else you ought to know, Sergeant. I'm not saying that Bode's law isn't a coincidence, you understand. But the odd thing is, it also works for the moons of the planets. Ellen Duncan sat on the hillside waiting for David Weir to arrive. To her delight, Inspector Evans' aerial photographs showed the grass covering the cave site to be a slightly different hue from the surrounding area. She heard the sound of a small petrol engine and jumped to her feet. She caught a flash of movement out of the corner of her eye. A crab-like device was scurrying down the slope. It disappeared from sight. Vicky had said something about a mechanical crab. David appeared, riding his digger, climbing the narrow track from the lake. David, I think I've found the site of a cave. Ellen gave him the photograph and pointed out the discoloration. This isn't cave country, Ellen. Ellen indicated her little cairn marker. Please, David, just dig. There. levelish and down at a straight angle. The first bucketful to be dumped on one side was yellowish loam and clay. Half a metre into the bank, and he was dumping heavy blue clay that stuck to the bucket. Eventually he was working blind, the digger's arm fully extended, reaching 2 metres into the tunnel. "I can't go much deeper, Ellen. We're going to have to—" "Bloody hell!" Ellen's eyes lit up with hope. "What?" "There's nothing there. No resistance. We've broken through." David backed the digger, and Ellen grabbed her torch, ignoring David's suggestion that they shore up the roof. She wriggled into the hole. "Hello?" she called. She emerged backwards, streaked with clay. "Come on, David. There's just enough height to stand." David wriggled through the tunnel and into the cave. The torchlight flashed on bright points of garnet and silicates, sprinkled about the rock face like stardust. They were in a narrow triangular chamber, formed by slabs of fractured stratum. Ellen's torch picked out a darker triangle that led into a narrow passage. She directed the beam down, and they saw the unmistakable mark of man. Flat stones, skillfully tessellated to form a floor. "It's exactly how I saw it." Ellen moved forward, telling David to keep to one side because she had seen footprints. The passage was at least 10 metres long. David was about to suggest that they go back and fetch better lights, when their voices suddenly acquired a noticeable echo, and the torch's beam plunged into nothingness. Ellen swung the light, screamed, and dropped the torch. In the half-second before darkness engulfed them, they both saw the huge, wide-eyed, salivating creature charging straight at them. It was quiet now. The shop was closed, and Vicky had been sent home. Ellen sat at her computer, feeling relaxed and content, going through her pictures for the 20th time. The first showed strands of reddish wool, hanging like a huge blanket from the great beast, so realistic that she imagined she could reach out and touch them. The second photo showed David standing beside the Paleolithic mural. It gave a better indication of the woolly mammoth's size. The beast stood about 4 metres to its withers. The artists had exploited a natural protrusion in the rock to give the great beast's head a startling 3-dimensional quality. The huge head was lowered, as if about to charge. Its tusks were formidable, sweeping outwards and then inwards, the tips crossing each other. David came padding bootless through the back door. He flopped into a chair. "Done. Just beat the light. All the spoil's been taken away in the dumper. I cut an old sheep hurdle to fit into the opening and put the turf back." He fell silent, watching the changing images on the monitor. They had found 6 hunting scenes in all. "Amazing," said David. They had discovered perspective. They knew that painting figures higher up and smaller and fainter made them appear further away. I took another look before closing up. I studied the lines with a halogen lamp and a magnifying glass. None of the paint strokes are continuous. They're broken up by tiny erosion gaps and crystalline formations. Meaning? Meaning that the paintings are genuine. That's something a forger could never reproduce. There is something that's bothering me about the mammoth painting, Ellen. Light. You need good light to get such even colouring. They'd never have got enough from lamps, and the smoke from torches would have choked them. The obvious always eludes us. Ellen made a sketch of the wind-trap horn with its mammoth intestine ducting. They would position a horn so it was pointing into the prevailing wind and pipe the draught into the cave where they were working. It provided fresh air and drove out the smoke from the torches at the same time. David shook his head in wonder. Air conditioning. Vicky Taylor slipped out of the darkened house and made her way into Pentworth. She walked with her arms folded, supporting her hand. The lump above her wrist was larger now, and her artificial hand needed frequent attention to keep it from slipping off. Hunger pains had returned to torment her. She neared the open gates of Pentworth Manor. 30 black-uniformed security guards were patrolling the grounds. They were on private land and armed with weapons that were barely legal. A skull-jarring beat and strobe lights greeted Vicky as she entered Pentworth Manor's former ballroom. None of the revellers appeared to be over 30, and their clothes ranged from fancy dress and evening suits to, in the case of the girls dancing on stage, no clothes at all. Vicky groped her way around the tables surrounding the packed dance floor. At the far end of the ballroom was a well-stocked buffet table, and Vicky started in on a plate of vol au vent. Nearby was a dais on which a white-gowned Adrian Roscoe and his acolytes were seated at a table, looking down on proceedings with evident approval. Vicky downed a glass of champagne. She was experiencing the same sensation of euphoria and well-being as when she had raided the fridge the previous morning. "Vicky, my darling, you came." It was Nelson Faraday, full of charm and smiles. He enveloped Vicky in his huge black cloak and kissed her. "Have you seen around the house? It's magnificent." Vicky allowed herself to be shepherded through a side door and into a long passage. Faraday pushed open a heavy door, padded on the inside with green hide. He ushered her into a spacious room dominated by a divan bed. "This used to be the small library. It has a very beautiful panelled ceiling. You must look." He turned her around and gave her a gentle push. The bed caught her at the back of her knees, and she fell onto it. She was about to laughingly apologize when she saw that Faraday was kneeling by her legs. Vicky tried to get up, but he caught her left arm and pushed her back. She heaved free and lashed out at his face. He made a grab for her hand, caught it, and found that it came away. Underneath was a baby's fist, clenched and pink, growing from the stump. And then all the lights went out. Kathy Price was the first to encounter the Force Wall in its finished state. She was heading south in her E-Type, accelerating hard, when the street and shop lights went out. A full moon broke through the cloud, illuminating the straight stretch of the Roman road to Chichester. She was 5 miles south of Pentworth when the impossible happened. The car was clawed to a straight-line standstill, like a fighter hitting a carrier's deck and catching on the arrestor wires. She gunned the engine. The tires spun, but the car went nowhere. More baffled than frightened, she realized that the car was moving. Backwards. She had the presence of mind to snick into reverse. The engine revved, the clutch bit, and the car screeched backwards. She stopped and looked in front of her. The moonlight picked out ferns, saplings, grass, but no road. 10 meters ahead, the A285 came to an abrupt end. She tried to recall a news report she'd half heard on local radio, something about road surface problems. Was it possible that they'd go to the trouble of ripping up the road? And even put grass back? No. Yet something strange had stopped the car, like running into a wall of mattresses. She dropped into first and trickled the car forward. The resistance felt like she was driving on melting tar. The moon and stars blacked out, and once again she was forced inexorably backwards. She turned the car around and headed back. Okay, then, she'd take the Pulborough Road, east of the town. 5 kilometres outside Pentworth, the same thing happened again. The northbound leg of the A283 was no better. Fuming, she returned to a home in which nothing worked. She pulled herself up the stairs to her room. She couldn't even make coffee. There was nothing for it but to go to bed. The spider, sitting on the roof of Hill House, waited for her to sleep. Following the completion of the Force Wall that night, it had been required to keep a watch and determine what effect it might have on the first person to encounter it. The spider had judged that Kathy and her car were okay, but it was obliged to make certain. When its quarry was asleep,
The spider entered at the window, aging the glass as it had done before. The spider moved to Cathy's foot, which was hanging over the side of the bed. 5 minutes later, its analysis was complete. Some damage to the neural network controlling balance was subjected to close scrutiny. But it was found to be old and easily repairable. It started towards the window. A chill draught woke Cathy. She saw the movement on the carpet, seized a glass from her bedside table and flung it. The spider reared and spat a jet of gas in her face. In the half-second before she lost consciousness, Cathy saw the outline of a crab-like creature. The spider left the bedroom and flew across the town to Pentworth Lake. Landing in the exact centre, it sank out of sight. In the darkness and confusion, Vicky rolled sideways off the divan and crawled around the edge of the room until she found the door. She scrambled to her feet, yanked the door open and staggered into the passage. She ran towards the sound of shouting. Headlights of parked cars came on, throwing blinding beams through the windows. The fire alarm system had sensed the loss of power and was howling. Vicky found her way to the ballroom. The buffet table was overturned, food and plates scattered across the floor. At the far end of the ballroom, the last of the guests were leaving in response to the shouted orders of 2 security men. Vicky approached them. "It's okay, miss. No fire. No need to panic. Just a power cut that set the alarms off." There was a sudden commotion from the back of the ballroom. Nelson Faraday was shouting to the guards. Vicky charged, uttering a piercing scream as she ran forward. She plunged into the crowd in the courtyard who, drunk and laughing, were of little use to her. She ran on. After 200 metres she slowed and allowed herself a backwards glance. No street lighting. No lit-up shop fronts. Just moonlight. She ran on, no clear plan in mind other than to put distance between herself and Pentworth Manor. Ellen Duncan's shop front beckoned her through the semi-darkness. She pounded on the side door and yelled through the letterbox. A window opened upstairs. "Vicky! Oh, my God!" A flash of torch on the stairs. The door opened and Vicky collapsed, sobbing, into the arms of Ellen Duncan. Bob Harding was woken at 4 in the morning by a police car arriving outside his shop. The power cut had left the house in darkness, so he groped around for a torch and stumbled downstairs. "We're extremely sorry to disturb you, Mr. Harding," said Inspector Evans. "We need your advice on an urgent matter." 15 minutes later, Harding stood at the police's southern roadblock, pressing his fingers against the yielding, invisible wall. Just beyond the bizarre resistance, the road ended suddenly. He clenched his fist and punched. It was like hitting a cushion. Evans took Harding to one side. "I believe you're an advisor on several government scientific committees, Mr. Harding. Perhaps you'd be good enough to tell me what all this is about?" Harding watched a policeman leaning against the force wall, his arms outstretched. "You say it's all around the town?" "A 3-mile radius around Pentworth Lake. It seems that the town's completely cut off. No electricity, no gas, no water, no phones, no radio or TV. Even the roads stop." There was a silence. Harding pointed at the moon and stars. "Light's getting through it." Evans' tone hardened. "So what is it? Some sort of experiment that's gone wrong?" Harding met the police officer's gaze. "I don't know, Mr. Evans. I simply have no idea." Ellen went to fetch Dr. Millicent Vaughan and brought her back to the shop. Ellen's bedroom was lit with candles, and Vicky lay, clearly still upset, curled up on Ellen's bed. The doctor questioned her carefully, noting the bruising on her legs and the fact that she was trying to conceal her left hand. "What about the growth you showed me this afternoon?" "It's all right now, Doctor. Really?" Vicky slowly withdrew her left arm from the bedsheets. The doctor stared at Vicky's hand. "You'll have to take it off if I'm going to examine—" "I can't," Vicky whispered, panic catching in her throat. "It's grown into a real one. Look!" She concentrated hard and managed to waggle 2 of the fingers. It was some moments before the doctor managed to speak. "Can you make a fist?" Vicky did so slowly. The doctor ran her fingertips over the wrist and knuckles. She was holding a perfect hand. "It started last night. It just kept on growing and growing. It's horrible, Doctor. Some sort of horrible... She searched for the right word. "Miracle." "Why do you say horrible, Vicky?" "Because it's useless. I can't do anything with it. I won't be able to wear my proper hand and I'll be helpless." Vicky leaned forward, convulsed with sobs. "Have you tried to use it?" "Yes." Dr. Vaughan placed her bag on the bed. "Try to pick it up." Slowly, Vicky lifted the bag. The despair was fading from her eyes. She turned to look at Dr. Vaughan. "I don't want anyone else to know about it, Doctor. Not just yet. I need time." Millicent wound a bandage around the wrist, and Vicky studied the effect of a slight clench, the normal position of her artificial hand. There was the sound of a car drawing up outside. "That'll be your mother." Dr. Vaughan descended the stairs and addressed herself to Mrs. Taylor and Ellen. "Vicky is fine. Better than she's been in years. I think it would be best if she were left alone. Good night." The doctor drove her car 200 metres and had to stop. Such was her trembling. She pressed her head against the steering wheel. For the first time in her life she felt a powerful need to visit a church. The next morning was bright and sunny. It was unusually warm and humid for March. The air was clear. Bob Harding stood in Cathy Price's bedroom and surveyed the scene from her magnificent telescope. He checked the point where Pratchett's farm should have stood, just beyond the line of the force wall. There was nothing. No barns, no outbuildings, just wind-swept downland. Harding made a 360-degree survey of the countryside. At a radius of just over 5 kilometres from Pentworth Lake, normality ceased. Inside the radius, all was as it should be. Farms and outhouses, houses, roads and fields. But beyond the periphery of the force wall, or whatever it was, there was nothing but a steppe-like landscape. Harding roamed the telescope over the town. Good Lord! Is that normal for this time on a Sunday morning? All those people pouring out of the church? Cathy took a turn studying the scene. They're frightened. In the courtyard of Pentworth Manor she could see the white-gowned figure of Adrian Roscoe preaching to a crowd. He's never done that before. Wonder what he's saying. Bob Harding started stowing things in his rucksack. Cathy turned to him. I must have been notching a ton when I hit the wall, and yet the car doesn't have a scratch on it. I think it has something to do with the UFO I saw the night of the storm. Now, don't look at me like that. I don't miss much up here, and it's the first one I ever saw. Check with the police. They'll have my name on their log. All you saw was a plane heading into Gatwick. That's what the police said. Except that planes have lights. This didn't. If it hadn't been for the lightning, I wouldn't have seen it at all. She swung back round and focused in on the distant hills. It's like looking at the past. Like it must have been thousands of years ago. Harding stared at her. He hurriedly finished packing and bounded down the stairs. Outside Hill House, Harding pulled a handheld transceiver from his rucksack and selected a pre-arranged police channel. He pressed the PPT button and gave his amateur radio call sign. I've completed the survey and I think I may have something. Inspector Evans has asked that you meet with Sergeant Malone outside Pentworth Manor. I'm on my way. 10 minutes. By the time Harding had reached the gates of Pentworth Manor, Roscoe had disappeared, but there was a queue of people stretching from the courtyard. The Bodian Brethren's huge Winnebago, manned by smiling sentinels, was serving food to the waiting crowds.
They were not taking money. Black uniformed security men strolled around the courtyard, exchanging small talk with members of the public. "Have some fries, Councillor. They're good." Mike Malone was approaching, holding out a bag of chips. "What's going on, Sergeant?" "Hearts and minds, Mr. Harding. Roscoe knocked up the manager of Freeze Fair this morning and bought his entire stock of frozen food. They're storing it in the dairy's delivery trucks. It's a shrewd move. A sign of leadership, control and authority." "You mean Roscoe preached his crackpot message to all these people and they listened to him?" "No, he didn't. All he said was that the brethren were here to help. Wartime spirit, mutual cooperation. Do you realise that Roscoe's brethren represent the biggest organisation in Pentworth?" "But surely there's the police." Harding's voice trailed off as he recognised the inaccuracy of the statement. 8 officers, 2 PCs, a couple of specials. Roscoe's got his 50 so-called sentinels. He's got employees managing the dairy and the bakery. And then there are the 30 security men he booked for last night's party. They can't leave now, so he's stuck with them. It's all changed." "What has?" 100 years ago, Pentworth was self-sufficient and self-governing. The farms fed the populace, and the populace provided labour and local government. We had our own school boards, healthcare, the police, the local council, even a jail. What's Pentworth Council responsible for now? Changing street light bulbs. Harding smiled. That's about the size of it. Man's greatest invention isn't writing, Mr. Harding. It's government. Over the past 30 years, virtually the entire infrastructure of Pentworth's local government has been destroyed. The hospital's gone. We have no welfare office, no public health office. The library hardly ever opens. The magistrates' court's been closed. A successful system, painstakingly built up over 1,000 years, destroyed in less than 3 decades. And your point is? My point, Mr. Harding, is that human nature abhors a power vacuum. Power vacuums are always filled. That's what we're seeing here. Harding was silent for a moment. "We need to visit the wall." The 2 men drove to a point where the road gave way to wild countryside. They got out of the car and approached the cut-off point with caution. Harding pushed his hand gently into the wall and watched the area around his fingertips darken. "Can't feel any—" "Yes, I can. A sort of tingling sensation. Getting stronger. And now it's pushing back. Quite hard, too." Harding pulled his hand away and noticed that his fingertips had turned white. Harding unstrapped his wristwatch. He gripped it between his fingertips and pushed it into the wall. The second hand stopped its busy swing around the watch face and started again as he withdrew it. Malone tried the same thing with his digital model. The flashing colon stopped, and the numerals indicating seconds froze on 15. "Push it in harder," whispered Harding, his eyes gleaming with suppressed excitement. Malone did so, and the digits changed to 14, and then 13. When he pulled the watch out to rub his fingers, the digits changed to 22. Malone looked inquiringly at Harding. "Isn't this where you say that we're up against forces beyond our understanding?" "Well, I'll say that if it makes you feel better, Sergeant. But I'd rather say that we're up against something that's within our understanding, but beyond our ability." Sounds like a cop-out. It was Arthur C. Clarke who said that the products of a sufficiently advanced technology would seem like magic to a lesser technology. This wall is economical with energy. The polarizing effect is only evident as and when it's needed. That tells me that the people who made this are up against the same energy laws and design problems that confront any engineer. And if Kathy Price was right, what we're looking at is the past. Kathy Price? She put me onto the idea. I think the wall's inner boundary is the beginning of a time wedge. A centimetre's penetration is 1 second in the past, 2 centimeters, 2 seconds, and so on. The countryside beyond this thing looks like it predates man.
Malone touched his sleeve and pointed. Not 30 metres ahead, a giant deer had appeared in a clearing. It was bigger than a moose or elk, and its magnificent antlers had a spread of at least 3 metres. It moved to an overhanging branch and began to rub its antlers back and forth, as though it had an itch. Malone clapped his hands and shouted. The creature continued to rub its rack, unconcernedly. Eventually it tired of the project and melted back into the forest. What the hell was that? It was Malone's turn to provide information. Last year I gave my eldest daughter a big picture book of extinct creatures. She loves it, and we have to go through it every time I visit. That, if I'm not mistaken, was a megalosaurus. When did it become extinct? About 20,000 years ago. Malone and Harding stared at one another. You have a lot of radio gear, don't you, Mr. Harding? Can you use it while there's no power? I've got a huge truck battery that I use as my backup power supply. Would you be able to transmit on broadcast bands? I've got a couple of old Spectrum Band 2 transmitters. I could broadcast on FM if I wanted to. What's this leading up to, Sergeant? What's the first thing revolutionaries do in tin pot republics when they seize power? They grab the palace and the radio station. Well, Roscoe's already got the palace. We need to beat him to the radio station. Ellen met David Weir at his house to hear the first broadcast. Asquith Prescott, the chairman of Pentworth Town Council, was to make an address at 6 o'clock. The police cars with their PA systems had been driving round all afternoon, advertising the time and FM frequency. David switched on his portable radio. The tuner hit on a pilot tone. As the tone faded, Bob Harding's voice was heard. He announced the first broadcast of Radio Pentworth and introduced Prescott. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Prescott began. "I doubt that there's anyone in the Pentworth area who isn't aware of the extraordinary fate that has overtaken our community. As from last night, we have been enclosed by a seemingly impenetrable and invisible dome, effectively imprisoning some 6,000 of us within an area of 30 square miles. We are lucky in having the services of Councillor Robert Harding. It's thanks to him that I am able to talk to you now. It is a credit to the good sense of the people of Pentworth that there has been no panic. The loss of all our public utilities and our total isolation is causing massive problems for all of us. Our immediate concern is our air quality. It has got steadily worse today. Therefore, in the interests of us all, I ask that you do not use your cars or motorbikes unless it is absolutely necessary. Please remember that you must be economical with your usage of water, and on no account are lavatories to be flushed. If the crisis continues, we will call on everyone to set up voluntary groups to deal with day-to-day and long-term problems. The British have always been good at rising to challenges. Our best qualities shine in adversity. Father Adrian Roscoe and his Bodian brethren have already responded by providing free cooked lunches today, and will do so again tomorrow at Pentworth Manor between the hours of 12 and 2 p.m. From tomorrow morning, they will be starting to make deliveries of bread and milk. Priority will be given to those with children. With such public spiritedness and your fortitude and willingness to make sacrifices, I am confident that we will overcome all our problems. I will talk to you again at the same time tomorrow. Good night, and God bless you all." Harding came back on. "There will be an informal extraordinary meeting of the Town Council at Mr. Prescott's house at 10 tomorrow morning. All Town Councillors are urged to attend. Radio Pentworth is closing down. Good night. Please switch off your radio now." Locked in his workshop, Harding peered through the eyepiece of his telescope and marvelled at the night sky. The seeing was wonderful. There was no light pollution from street lights. The humidity was high, but there was no cloud. He set the telescope's azimuth and elevation vernier scales to Centre Polaris, the pole star, or North Star. It was a celestial hub whose stationary presence could be relied upon wherever you were in the Northern Hemisphere. And it was gone. He searched the heavens with his naked eye. Polaris was in the constellation Ursa Major, and now he searched for the ladle-like pattern. He found it. The entire constellation was offset several degrees from its usual position, and it was rotated through 180 degrees, so that Polaris was actually the furthest star in the ladle from celestial north. He took measurements to establish Polaris's new position, and set to work with the Sky Globe Planetarium program on his laptop. It took him a few minutes to come up with an answer. The night sky he was seeing was as it would have appeared 40,000 years ago. Vicky dropped her watch on the grass and dived into the swimming pool. The cold punched her breath from her body, but she didn't care. It was a glorious morning, and the pool would soon be unusable without electricity to run the filtration equipment. She'd always loved swimming, but now there was a special joy in being able to drive her body through the water, using equal power in both hands. Getting used to her new hand had come easier than she dared hope. She felt the joy of one who has been singled out by God to experience a wonderful miracle. There was just one dark cloud on the horizon. She wondered when she would see her beloved father again. The sombre moment passed, and she was off again, splashing the water to a bubbling foam, revelling in the experience of being young and being whole. When the cold was finally too much for her, she heaved herself from the pool and grabbed a towel. "Victoria Taylor?" Vicky spun around to meet a pair of smiling eyes. They belonged to a pretty girl dressed in the white skirt and red smock of Pentworth Manor Dairy. She was carrying a basket of milk cartons. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I make you jump?" Vicky tugged the towel around her shoulders and hid her hands. "I did call out. I thought you heard me. I'm Claire Lake from the dairy. We're delivering milk. You probably heard about it on the radio yesterday. You're down for half a litre. We've got some long life. Don't worry. It's free." Vicky snaked her right hand from the folds of the towel and took it, thanking the girl. "You are Victoria Taylor, aren't you?" "No one calls me Victoria. It's always Vicky." "Oh. Then this is yours." Claire pulled aside a cloth in the basket and held out Vicky's artificial hand. "You lost it at the party." Vicky took it, again with her right hand. "I'm glad it's found its home. I'll bring more milk tomorrow." She turned at the gate to wave goodbye, but Vicky had disappeared. Cathy Price had always been able to stand for short periods, in much the same way as a coin can be stood on edge. If there was any significant change in her centre of gravity, her lack of balance meant that she would fall. Simple activities, such as cleaning her teeth, were possible, but she needed to have the security of grab handles close to hand. 30 seconds under the icy cold shower were enough. She backed out of the shower cabinet, her hair and eyes still running with unrinsed shampoo, and groped blindly for a towel. It wasn't in its normal place. She remembered that she had left it hanging on the door, and took a step in that direction. She reached for a grab handle and missed. Normally she would have stumbled, but this time, to her astonishment, she actually managed to take 3 steps and reach the door, steady herself, and snatch the towel. She sat on the linen basket, wiped her eyes, and contemplated the distance from the shower to the door. Not possible, she told herself. She pulled on her dressing gown and felt in the pocket for the radio remote control to bring the wheelchair nearer. The machine started towards her, its motor purring sluggishly, and stopped. Damn! It hasn't been charged for 2 nights. Now what do I do? She hated crawling. Measuring the distance between herself and the wheelchair with a practised eye, she decided that a good lurch would enable her to reach it.
Once seated, she could propel it manually. The wheelchair's parking brake had failed to engage. The thing rolled out of her clutches when she staggered towards it, but instead of falling over, she somehow remained standing, in an awkward position that normally would have meant a certain fall. I'm standing. My God, I'm actually standing. A moment later, Cathy discovered that she could do more than merely stand. She could walk. David Weir and Ellen Duncan joined their fellow town councillors as they assembled for the first emergency meeting. The change in their chairman was evident to them all. Asquith Prescott's usual flamboyant three-piece had been replaced by a sober white safari suit. He sat at the head of the long table, arms folded, his normally florid features set into a stern glower. He pointed to a blackboard. "That's the agenda. We have urgent business to transact." Prescott placed a cassette tape recorder on the table and started it recording. "I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Inspector Harvey Evans and Dr. Millicent Vaughan. Detective Sergeant Mike Malone is here as my aide." Malone's impassive expression gave no indication of his dislike of the surprise post. "An apology for absence has been received from Councillor Father Adrian Roscoe. No one knows how long the crisis will last. What I propose is that this meeting concerns itself with short-term essential matters to get us through the next 7 days. We'll start with a report from Councillor Robert Harding." Bob Harding rose. He spoke quickly from notes, briefly outlining what everyone now knew about the force wall and moving on to his findings the previous night. "So you think that the sun and moon and stars we're seeing is some sort of generated image from 40,000 years ago?" Prescott queried. "That's my analysis, Mr. Chairman. The wall is definitely not the product of human technology. That leaves extraterrestrial technology. It seems that the claims of those who saw an object in the sky last Tuesday may have been accurate after all. The ufologists who scoured the area on Wednesday and Thursday didn't find anything because they didn't investigate Pentworth Lake, which is the geographic centre of the wall. An excellent choice of hiding place for a spacecraft. I took some readings first thing this morning with a small gravimeter. There's a definite anomaly in the centre of the lake." "How deep, Councillor?" asked Prescott. "I'm sorry, my gravimeter doesn't give range." "More to the point, where are these aliens from?" one of the older councillors demanded. "We know enough about the solar system to rule out the planets. That leaves our galaxy, the Milky Way. Our nearest star is Proxima Centauri, a Type M red dwarf flare star, whose light takes 4.3 years to reach us. For the sake of argument, let us assume that Centauri has a planetary system, and that's where our visitors are from. We know they can't be from anywhere nearer, and the probability is that they're from somewhere a good deal further away. Certain characteristics of the wall indicate that our visitors are not in possession of the sort of super-advanced technology favoured by most science fiction writers. From what I've observed, I doubt if they're much more than 300 years ahead of us. If I make another supposition and give our visitors' spacecraft the capability of 1/5 of the speed of light, it follows that the journey from Centauri to Earth would have taken them around 22 years, a round trip of 44 years. An awesome time span, but within the realms of possibility for a survey expedition by determined people with inquiring minds. The scientist in me rebels at all this stretching of a theory, but since I've started, I believe that our visitors had problems with their spacecraft when they went into orbit around the Earth. Rather than remain in orbit and risk detection and possible destruction by us, they searched for a haven. Well, where better than a deep swamp? And, as an added safeguard, they threw up a protective sphere around themselves. Then they broadcast for help. They generated a lot of broadband radio noise on Thursday and Friday, which led to the drowning of 2 radio communications agency investigators. The visitors' SOS is now on its way to Centauri and will reach it in 4 years and 4 months. Assuming that their HQ can launch a rescue mission right away, we can expect to be reluctant hosts to our visitors for the next 27 years. Mr. Chairman, may I speak, please?" asked Malone. "Go ahead, Sergeant." "I was jogging home late on Friday night when a strange machine followed me. It was like a mechanical crab, very hard to see, as if it were made of glass. But I definitely saw it quite clearly at one point. David felt Ellen stiffen suddenly. She was staring fixedly at Malone. I tried to catch it, and the thing turned into an electric helicopter and vanished. You never reported it? Inspector Evans observed. I'm reporting it now, Mr. Evans. I didn't altogether believe it myself, and doubted if anyone else would. I've seen it too, Mr. Chairman, said Ellen abruptly. Go ahead, Councillor Duncan. It was after I'd seen you and Inspector Evans by the lake on Saturday morning. It was only a glimpse. I thought I'd imagined it at the time. And Vicky Taylor, who works for me on Saturday mornings, has seen it too. Harding started firing questions, but Prescott cut him short. I think it would be best, Councillor, if I ask Sergeant Malone to collect witness statements. Otherwise we'll be here all day. Next item on the agenda is drinking water. They ascertained that they had only 3 days' drinking supply left in their domestic tanks. However, the town had a disused water tower that could, with the help of many hands, be refilled by running a diesel pump from the original artesian well. They moved on to the subject of food. The town had roughly 10 days' supply in shops and larders. A census would be arranged to determine how much grain was held in silos. Thanks to the Bodian Brethren, much frozen food had been saved. Permission was granted for them to keep running their generator, thus keeping the bakery and dairy operational. Prescott drew the meeting to a close, and the councillors said their goodbyes. I'm astonished at the change in him, said David. He exuded confidence. Power, said Ellen savagely. That's all he's interested in. Did you see the way his eyes lit up when Bob Harding talked about us being trapped for years? He sees himself as the founder of a new dynasty. David laughed. 30 square miles? Some dynasty, Ellen. Listen. OK, he's a power-grubbing little toad. But what do his motives matter as long as he does a good job? He's got people eating out of his hand. Inspector Evans and Asquith Prescott sat at a garden table on Prescott's lawn, having enjoyed a heavy lunch. Prescott sipped his scotch. This situation creates an interesting dilemma. You see, Pentworth is what's called beyond jurisdiction. Under the present circumstances, it is beyond the enforcement of the monarch's writ. In other words, we're temporarily not part of the United Kingdom. Of course, when the crisis is over, it will return to its former state. And were this to happen, I can see that there would be only one course of action open to the Lord Chancellor. He would have to issue retrospective ratification of all reasonable actions taken by a democratically elected emergency government, where such actions were in the interest of the populace as a whole. Do you see where I'm going, Harvey? Yes, said Evans, feeling that he was finally getting the measure of the man. You want the police to be placed under your control? Not my control, Harvey. The control of Pentworth Emergency Council. Evans mopped his face. He didn't want a confrontation. It will need thinking about. There's no need to change anything just yet. No, not just yet, agreed Prescott. But this honeymoon period with the people won't last if the crisis continues. Within a month or so, we'll need a much enlarged and much tougher police force. One that will be called upon to enforce a number of unpopular measures. Of the several task forces Prescott set up, the one to deal with the water problem produced the fastest results. On Tuesday they broke open a southern water store and installed standpipes at several locations around the town. With the use of a diesel pump, a limited drinking water supply was back on stream by Wednesday evening. On Wednesday morning the schools reopened, with parents required to provide packed lunches for their children. On Thursday, the sanitation task force opened the first set of public toilets, consisting of a row of 20 garden sheds, each one fitted with a flushing lavatory supplied from a common header tank. Overall, morale was remarkably high, boosted to a considerable extent by the buzz of activity orchestrated by the town hall. In his broadcasts, Prescott made repeated calls for volunteers, larded with his "Your community needs you." The continuing warm weather helped. Then, early on Friday morning, an hour before dawn, something happened that Bob Harding had been waiting for. It rained. With the sun's ground evaporation raising the humidity to exceptional levels, he knew that rain was inevitable, but it was a huge relief when it finally came. He stood in the middle of his lawn in his pyjamas, enjoying the sensation of the soft, warm splashes while holding up a sterilized flask to catch a sample. He returned to his kitchen and used a swimming pool test kit to measure the sample's pH. The mauve, it turned, matched the colour chart for a pH of 7.5, meaning that the rainwater was neutral, neither acid nor alkaline. It was the purest water to have fallen on Pentworth for many years, and its effect would be profound. Adrian Roscoe stared across the candlelit table at his guest. All this talk of UFOs and mechanical crabs is nothing but a crude smokescreen, Asquith.
There are 4 witnesses who claim to have seen a mechanical crab-like device, Adrian.
Prescott fiddled with the stem of his brandy balloon. Roscoe leaned forward.
This Duncan shopkeeper woman. A glimpse of something that sounds like a kid's radio-controlled toy? The same for her apprentice, Vicky Taylor. Sergeant Malone saw something in the dark as he returned home after a 14-hour shift. And as for Kathy Price, she saw something through her telescope at night, at a distance of half a mile. What sort of evidence is that? There is the evidence of the wall.
Roscoe stared fixedly at his guest, willing him to look up. He succeeded. Yes. Now that is evidence, Asquith. Evidence of God's work. A divine curse. We have been isolated as a punishment for permitting his enemies to practice their evil within our midst.
I don't follow you.
Where is the centre of the wall? Roscoe demanded.
Pentworth Lake.
Who owns it?
Ellen Duncan.
Exactly. That the centre of the wall's circle is on land owned by the Duncan woman is God's way of pointing her out to us. Consider the facts. Malone is a friend of hers. Catherine Price is a regular customer. And Victoria Taylor works for her as an apprentice in her witchcraft obscenities.
Oh, really, Adrian? Ellen Duncan is a herbalist, nothing more.
I seem to recollect you once telling me that you suspected the Duncan woman of being behind your being dropped as a parliamentary candidate.
Well, yes.
Roscoe's fist came down on the table. She's a witch, and I can prove it. He tugged an old-fashioned bell-pull. A young sentinel entered, carrying a camcorder that she placed on the table. She gave Prescott a dazzling smile, and withdrew. Roscoe swung out the camcorder's large LCD monitor screen and started the tape. The colour picture stood out large and clear in the dimly lit room. It showed Vicky and her mother playing table tennis in their garden. Out-of-focus foliage around the edge of the frame indicated that the shot had been taken surreptitiously. The Taylor girl didn't go back to school when it reopened. Look carefully, and you'll see why. The picture zoomed in on Vicky and panned several times from hand to hand.
Good God, Prescott murmured. She's got 2 hands.
And she works for the Duncan woman. She's her apprentice. Prescott shook his head disbelievingly. Ellen Duncan is quite definitely a witch. Wouldn't you say, Asquith? The Pentworth Emergency Council gathered in the town hall for their second meeting. Just before the session, a small but eager group had been waiting to greet the chairman, Asquith Prescott. They had shaken his hand, told him what a fine fellow he was, and what a wonderful job he was doing. Prescott had revelled in the adulation, clapping people on the back. His florid features flushed pink with pleasure.
"Right," said Prescott. "Before we get started, I have a brief statement to make. There's been criticism directed at me from some quarters because a work voucher scheme has been introduced without reference to the council.
I made the decision following a meeting with a deputation from the banks. Early indications are that the scheme is a success. However, if there's a proposer and seconder and 2 assenters for my resignation, I will do so here and now and re-stand for election.
Prescott's unexpected statement caught Ellen Duncan off guard and neatly sabotaged her plans for a censure motion. It would be impossible to get 4 councillors to oppose Prescott before a vote was cast. Prescott glanced confidently at everyone in turn.
So I continue as chairman. Are we all agreed?
A shrewd operator would single out Ellen Duncan's approval, thought Sergeant Malone.
Councillor Duncan?
Prescott inquired. No objections, Mr. Chairman, said Ellen stonily.
Minute that, please, Town Clerk. Unanimous rejection of my offer to resign.
By God, he's learning fast, thought Malone.
Excellent. First item, air quality. Councillor Harding.
Bob Harding reported that the sharp rise in carbon dioxide, sulphur and carbon monoxide levels experienced after the start of the crisis had been checked and was falling. Then Prescott turned their attention to the Agricultural Task Force.
The task force has pointed out that we must act now to pool all vegetable seed and seed potatoes.
And supposing people refuse? Ellen inquired.
Prescott regarded her frostily. The cooperation with my appeals has been remarkable so far, Councillor Duncan. I'm sure that if problems arise, we'll be able to rely on Inspector Evans and his police force to exercise a degree of assertiveness.
Harvey Evans looked as though he were about to say something, but remained silent.
With plenty of grain in stock, so we have to concentrate on vegetables. Our task force has advised that all growers implement a policy of crop rotation, and the ploughing can be done with horses. We have to start relearning old techniques.
The meeting lasted through into the warm afternoon. Contingency plans were made to recharge radio batteries, as Radio Pentworth would remain a vital link between the council and the community. The old courthouse was redesignated Government House, and it was agreed that the administration of the area would require at least 200 staff. Prescott invited Inspector Evans to make a statement on policing. Harvey Evans rose. The 3-page report he held before him had taken half the night to write.
"Well, that looks ominous, Inspector," said Prescott, before the officer had a chance to speak. "Could we have a summary, please?"
Evans was thrown.
"I wanted the council to be informed. The town clerk will incorporate your report as an appendix in the minutes. And minute a unanimous vote of thanks to Inspector Evans and his force for their tremendous efforts. I now propose that we hold urgent discussions with him to determine ways and means of expanding the police. If everyone is in agreement, I'll be happy to look into the problem with him."
Ellen was incensed. All day, policy decisions had been swept through on the back of Prescott's on-the-nod votes. She was on her feet, eyes blazing. "Mr. Chairman, this is unconstitutional. Such an important matter must be discussed." Prescott looked genuinely taken aback.
"Unconstitutional, Councillor? There can be nothing constitutionally amiss with Inspector Evans and myself coming up with a plan to strengthen the police force and putting it to the next full meeting."
The motion was proposed, seconded, and passed, with only Ellen's vote against.
"Last point," said Prescott. "We need someone on hand to deal with the day-to-day problems that have been cropping up. I propose being at Government House every day to help with the smooth running of things."
Outside the town hall, Ellen went for David like a Rottweiler. "You stupid, stupid idiot! Do you have any idea what you've done? You and all the other sheep have given that man unlimited powers. You've even given him a presidential office." "Miss Duncan?" Ellen spun around. Sergeant Malone was looking down at her. He smiled at David as he whispered in her ear, "If I'd had voting rights in there, they would have been for you." "Thank you, Mr. Malone. All dictators, even elective dictators, like simplicity. It makes for easier understanding and therefore control. The regulations such governments issue may be complex. But the administrative lines are short and simple. The sound of a cracking whip will then reach all ears quickly and effectively. Cathy Price called Millicent Vaughan to her home. Dr. Vaughan was not impressed. The last 2 weeks had been ones of unremitting frustration and exhaustion. She was busy helping to set up a makeshift hospital. "Your message said it was urgent, yet I found you looking fit." "If you would just listen." "Listen? I don't have time to listen. My eyes tell me there's nothing wrong." The doctor grabbed her bag and made to leave. "If you won't listen, look." Millicent was about to slam the door when she looked back. Cathy Price was standing. Now she was taking steps across the room. The two women stared at one another. Cathy was the first to speak. "It was 2 weeks ago, when the electricity went off. My wheelchair. I tried to reach it, then this happened. I haven't dared tell anyone, but it's getting a bit better each day." "Can you stand on one leg?" "Just about." Cathy wobbled a little, but the demonstration showed that her balance had returned. For the first time, Millicent noticed that Cathy's normal bravura was gone. Her face was drawn, almost haggard. Millicent reached across and took hold of Cathy's wrist to take her pulse. The young woman grasped the doctor's hands as though she were drowning. "I can cope with not being able to walk. I've managed for years, but now I don't even know if it's going to last. I might go to bed tonight and wake up tomorrow no longer able. I haven't even had the nerve to pick up the phone and tell anyone. I was told I'd never walk." "Doctors can be wrong, you know. Your brain has learnt again. I don't know how, but it won't go away." Millicent returned to her surgery and shut herself in her consulting room with Cathy Price's file. It contained reports from 2 of the country's leading neurologists. Their findings were unequivocal. Catherine Price would never be able to recover her sense of balance. As always when she was sitting in her cave, Ellen lost all sense of time. There was a therapeutic quality to staring at those wonderful hunting scenes of 40,000 years ago. The white glare from David's halogen lamp breathed a strange, surreal life into the creatures before her. The lantern flickered and dimmed. David put his arm around her. "Come on. We'll need the light to close up. Have you decided?" Ellen nodded. "As long as the wall stays in place, we must say nothing to anyone about our discovery of this place. I can't afford to keep a 24-hour guard, and nor can you. So many people hate me. To destroy this would be the easiest way of hurting me." "Oh, you exaggerate, Ellen." "Do I?" They crawled out of the cave, repositioned the hurdle in the tunnel opening and covered it with soil. "Let's climb up to the temple," Ellen suggested on an impulse. They trudged up the steep slope arm in arm to the Temple of the Winds, and stood in silence by the marker obelisk, taking in the scene. The lake, the stream, and the hills all were bathed in the moon's ethereal light. In the distance, oil lamps glowed in the windows of farmhouses. Ellen leaned against David, his arms around her waist. "My mother used to bring me up here when I was a girl and tell me hoary old legends about this place." "Such as?" "That the Beaker people used to make human sacrifices to their gods here. When I got interested in prehistory, I did some checking, and there's not a shred of evidence that they did. But a witch was once scourged here." "You're joking." 1646. An agent of the Witchfinder General ordered the arrest of an Eleanor of Fittleworth. She was about my age. They brought her up here, where she was stripped, beaten, and raped. Then she was taken back to Pentworth and burnt at the stake in Market Square. The buildings around the square were thatched in those days, and half the town caught fire. After that, the people of Pentworth would have nothing more to do with the Witchfinder General." "All a long time ago," remarked David. "There are people alive today who were born in 1899. Their lives spanned 3 centuries. Just 4 people could link us with the scourging of Eleanor right where we're standing. It might as well be yesterday. Disease was rampant, children dying young, there was cholera and smallpox and 1,000 other diseases whose causes we now understand, so we no longer blame them on witches. But what if something else surfaces, something that causes misery and deprivation, something that people don't understand?
Like the force wall?
Yes. The old superstitions and beliefs are still with us. A few people even think that I'm a witch. What? Herbalism is often thought of as an offshoot of witchcraft. David, I want you to promise me something. This wall could outlast us. I want you to promise that you'll never reveal the whereabouts of the cave to anyone as long as the wall remains. Do you promise me?
Yes, of course. I promise.
The next day, Bob Harding made his way to Pentworth Museum and asked the curator if he might have access to the storeroom. The curator led him down a flight of stone steps and into a gloomy basement. There's bound to be something useful hidden in here. The storeroom was filled with old magazines and newspapers, rows of tall display cases and stacks of bulging tea chests. Harding had just started to search through the clutter when his eye was caught by a large mahogany cabinet, about the size of a piano. He peered at the oval nameplate. Western Electric Company, London, 1908. 100-subscriber exchange. Patents pending. He turned his attention to the nearest tea chests and opened one. He lifted out a small, polished mahogany box that was fitted with a crank handle, a microphone, and an ivory-handled headphone dangling on a length of cable. Telephones. Good morning, Mrs. Taylor. A smiling Sergeant Malone stood on the doorstep. Mr. Malone, if you've come to see Vicky, I'm afraid she isn't here. She's gone into town to prepare for the May Day Carnival. She's volunteered to be this year's witch. Actually, it was you I wanted to talk to. I expect you've heard on the radio about the increase in break-ins. Yes, it's awful. Everyone's trying to pull together, and we have this to put up with. Mr. Prescott said how overstretched the police were. Malone grimaced. An understatement, if ever there was one. I'm going round to outlying houses to check and advise on security. Would you have any objection to my checking your house? Help yourself. Malone made his way to Vicky's bedroom, deep in thought. He had just come from a visit to see Cathy Price. He had gone to collect a statement about her sighting of the crab-like device. Malone had witnessed Cathy's incredible recovery, and as they talked it became apparent that she had had a second sighting of the creature. She had shown him into her bedroom and described how the spider seemed to have entered her room without disturbing the window. After a careful examination, all he had been able to find was a slight discoloration to the window pane nearest Cathy's bed. Malone moved now to the window by the side of Vicky's bed, and, sure enough, there was the same discoloration of the glass. So, 2 definite visits by the device and 2 remarkable cures. There was no doubt in his mind that the spider was responsible. He made his way downstairs to rejoin Mrs. Taylor. It was the day of the spring carnival. Prescott sat at his desk in Government House, contentedly admiring his new office. His intercom buzzed. Father Adrian Roscoe wishes to speak to you, Mr. Chairman. Prescott pulled the antique telephone carefully across his desk and picked up the headphone.
Good morning, Adrian. What can I do for you?
Congratulations, Asquith. A working telephone system. I rang because I need to see you.
The carnival will be getting underway soon.
It's an urgent matter which is in both our interests to discuss. I'm coming round. Roscoe hung up. 5 minutes later, the leader of the Bodian Brethren was in Prescott's office. I've heard a most disturbing rumour that you're planning an attack on the wall, Asquith. Is this true?
Bob Harding's hatching something.
Raising a hand against the wall would be blasphemy. It was placed there by God as a punishment for our sins.
Prescott had heard this before. Roscoe had taken to touring the town, preaching this very message. "Let me guess what's on your mind, Adrian. The Duncan woman, correct?" God wants that daughter of Satan destroyed. "Yes. Well, it may be what God wants, what you want, and what I want are the same thing," said Prescott smoothly. "For example, I could find a use for those security men of yours. I need a security team to guard this building, so maybe you and I could do a little deal." Roscoe left 10 minutes later, leaving Prescott feeling very satisfied with himself. It was now only a matter of time before he was rid of Ellen Duncan. He picked up the telephone and summoned Inspector Evans. "Well, Harvey, I can't accept the idea, Asquith." "Why not?" "The dissolution of the police force. The word I used was reconstitution. Unfortunately, I do not have the luxury of personal choice. A whole host of council orders needs to be implemented quickly. We've tried coping with the existing police force, and we've failed." The silence in the office was broken by the sound of the public address system in the square being tested. Evans stood and looked at the activity below. "With respect, Asquith, these fun and games only add to the pressure on my officers." "Bringing the May Day Carnival forward is a morale booster." "You can't cope, Harvey, and you know you can't." Prescott picked up a list and gave it to the police officer. "Names and addresses of 20 volunteers willing to be recruited." "They wouldn't have the powers of police officers, would they?" "They don't even have to have the same name. We can call them public safety officers." Evans stared glumly out of the window. "I take it that we're in full agreement, then?" beamed Prescott. "If I were you, I'd go and meet your men and acquaint them with their new responsibilities." And with that, Prescott ushered him from the office. From the numbers arriving early to be sure of a good position, it seemed that the entire population of Pentworth was going to be crowded into the market square for the spring carnival. The maypole had already been erected, and beside it a custard pie vendor was setting up his stall. His wares had become the traditional ammunition to be used against the spring witch. A long barbecue occupied one side of the square. A team of butchers were busy with cleavers, preparing sides of beef. 20 beasts had been slaughtered for the event. Vicky made her way through the crowd. She was wearing gloves to hide her new left hand. There was a stir and some ragged cheering around the entrance to Government House when the white safari-suited figure of Asquith Prescott appeared. He mounted the steps to the stage that had been erected for the occasion. The crier rang his bell for silence. "My fellow citizens of Pentworth!" "Oh, God, a presidential address," Ellen Duncan muttered. "Today we are here to enjoy ourselves. Once our open council meeting is over, and I promise we'll keep it brief, there will be food and music and dancing the night away. I declare the Pentworth May Day Carnival open." A pipe band struck up, and the children started dancing around the maypole, under-rehearsed as always, and bumping into each other. Women laden with baskets of spring flowers created a floral dance area near the maypole. This was the signal for the 13 spring virgins, one for each full moon of the year, to get ready. Vicky joined 12 other teenage girls who were changing into flowing white chiffon dresses. Mrs. Williams, the lady in charge of the parade of virgins, clapped her hands. "Where's our witch? Vicky?" "Right here, Mrs. Williams." "You're much too pretty to make a convincing witch, dear. Do you have to wear both those gloves?" "I prefer to, Mrs. Williams." "Very well. Now, for goodness sake, start your run as soon as the fool gives you the cue, which is, he'll say, 'Run, run, run,' in a loud whisper," Vicky recited. The young children finished their dance and were hustled away.
The 13 virgins raced barefooted into the bright sunlight, skipping and whooping and kicking up flowers as they ran. They gathered about the maypole, each one holding a ribbon. The pipe band struck up again, this time a madrigal to which the girls moved with sinuous grace, weaving the coloured ribbons about the pole. The pipe band stopped playing when the conductor heard the slow beat of a bass drum. The crowd fell silent. 12 of the 13 girls formed a wide circle around the maypole, facing outward as they were showered with flowers. Vicky remained at the pole, dancing with an unself-conscious grace, taking hold of each ribbon in turn to gradually unwind the work of the troupe. In the square the fool appeared. He pranced into the sunlight, his bell pad and garters jingling, each silver bell in the form of a skull. In one hand he held an inflated pig's bladder on a stick, in the other an ancient pizzle whip. For this pagan dance he wore a frowning mask to scare off witches and demons. This was the ancient fertility dance, a direct appeal to the gods for fruitfulness in the coming year. The crowd remained unusually silent, sensing that this time the ceremony had a special significance. The people of Pentworth were alone, and there was no one to help them. They had been trapped for a month behind an impenetrable wall, created by forces or beings beyond their understanding. Behind the fool came the drummer, beating a slow but purposeful step. Following him was the hobby horse, a towering, hellish creature with staring eyes and flaring nostrils. It lurched to the left and right, its fearsome wooden teeth gnashing and clacking above the heads of onlookers. Children, who had been lifted onto shoulders for a better view, screamed as the sinister apparition threatened to devour them. The crowd pressed forward when they heard the measured beat of heavy, iron-tipped ash staffs. 2 columns of black and white-clad Morris men appeared. Sparks flashed from the impact of their iron heel-caps on the granite cobbles. The fool danced ahead, leaping from side to side, sometimes confronting spectators, pushing up his mask and sniffing them, with much exaggerated twitching of his nostrils. Ellen had seen the witch-sniffing part of the dance at many May Day carnivals, but this time she felt a cold, unexplainable fear welling up inside her. EX 2218. The dread message that they had scrawled across the window of her shop flashed before her eyes. The sun went out, and the silent crowd became a yelling mob, brandishing blazing torches and screaming abuse at an hysterical, naked young woman being driven across the square in a dog-cart. The woman was bound and bleeding. Bundles of wood were piled beneath a stake. The dog-cart turned, and for the first time Ellen saw the face of a young woman. It was a face she knew well. It was her own face. EX 2218. The terrible scene faded as quickly as it had come. David sensed her distress. "Ellen, what's the matter?" Nothing. I'm fine. Please don't make a fuss." She pretended to concentrate on the Morris men who had now encircled the 12 virgins. The men slammed their staffs onto the ground so that each one was pointing at a virgin. The girls skipped disdainfully over the prophet's staff. Smoke from the barbecue rolled over the square, causing a surreal effect, as though the dancers were enveloped in a primeval mist. The fool who had been leaping around the dancers noticed Vicky by the maypole. He looked up at the freely fluttering ribbons and uttered a shrill scream. The dancers froze. The bass drum fell silent. A shocked hush fell on the square. The fool advanced on Vicky. He pushed up his mask and came so close that she could smell the sweat streaming down his face. He sniffed her from head to toe and suddenly leapt backwards as though he had been stung. Vicky was both puzzled and surprised. The terror in the fool's eyes looked real. "Mekashefe," he spat. A solitary beat on the drum. "Mekashefe." "Something's wrong," Ellen whispered. "It's not usually like this." The fool backed away from Vicky, smoke swirling round him, his mask pushed up so that she could see the hatred in his eyes. Her muscles tensed, waiting for his cue that would send her racing off on a circuit of the square.
He never gave the cue. The fool uttered a wild scream and rushed at Vicky. She brought up her arm to ward off the blow, but the pizzle whip struck her. Vicky became a blur of white as she plunged through the circle. Her speed took those armed with custard pies by surprise. Several youths threw pies in her path, and she skidded, lost her balance, and went sprawling. "Enough!" Sergeant Malone bellowed. Blood was streaming from a long gash on Vicky's arm. "Okay," snapped Malone. "You've had your fun. The dance is over." Vicky was escorted to the safety of a nearby shop. The town crier's voice came over the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we start on the serious business of today, the open council meeting. Councillor Harding, to the stage." There was applause for the scientist as he stepped up to the microphone. In September 1991, 8 men and women locked themselves into an artificial 3.1-acre ecosystem in the Arizona desert. The building was called Biosphere 2, Biosphere 1 being the Earth. It was airtight and contained everything needed to sustain life. Plants would make food and oxygen, insects would pollinate the plants, and algae and bacteria would break down waste and purify the water. It had a miniature rainforest, some swamp, a 4-million-litre ocean, desert, savanna, and marshland. It was supposedly an ideal environment for the 8 biospherians. It didn't work. The pollinating insects became extinct, which meant that many of the plants were unable to reproduce. The soil consumed more oxygen than expected. As a result, the occupants suffered from oxygen deprivation, which in turn led to violent mood swings and irrational behaviour. Trees became diseased, water became polluted. The 7 of the original 8 biospherians who made it through 2 years lost 40% of their body weight, because they were competing with their livestock for food. In the post-mortem that followed, the project was deemed to have failed because so many mistakes were made. I disagree. I think it failed because of its size. It wasn't big enough to permit the drumbeat of nature to resonate. Sudden, unseasonable rainfall, flash floods, wind, lightning. Nature demands unexpected events. It needs wildness, a bit of chaos. Harding pointed to the smoke billowing from the barbecue. That breeze is carrying carbon from the smoke across the fields to feed plant life. It's taking moisture, which will drop as rain. Now, we must be thankful that Pentworth is large enough to permit this natural turbulence. Evaporation and condensation is at work. We have pure rainfall. We've calculated that Pentworth can double its population, possibly triple it, and still find food enough to feed us all. So we have good reason to celebrate today. Those nearest the barbecue were becoming increasingly distracted by the smells of cooking. Prescott mounted the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have some good news." He pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and flourished it. "This is the agenda for the council meeting we're about to hold." Prescott tore up the piece of paper and flung the pieces in the air. There was a storm of applause, wild cheering and whistles. Ellen stood transfixed for a few moments, unable to speak. "He's done it," she spat. "He's finally done it. He doesn't even need to consult us anymore. He can do anything he wants." It was the first time Malone had visited Inspector Evans' home. The senior police officer sat in his study, sipping nettle tea. "You haven't answered my question, sir." Evans smiled at him. "I'm finally out of the rat race, and you decide to start calling me sir. And I've decided to appreciate you now that it seems you won't be around anymore. I know that taking early retirement is a euphemism for being pushed out. I also know that you're not the sort of person to give in to a bully like Prescott. So what happened?" Evans drained his cup. "He called me into his office and announced that Adrian Roscoe's security men were to become a separate force under the command of Nelson Faraday, who would be answerable to him. I told him that I wasn't prepared to accept them as police officers, especially with a thug like Faraday in charge. He promised me a reasonable pension and invited me to resign. I'm thinking about becoming Pentworth's biggest honey producer. My wife started the hives before she died. So Prescott has appointed himself police commander. Evans nodded. He wants you to run the CID. I'd like you to stay on, Malone. I'd be happier knowing that there was at least one sane officer left in the nick. It'll be that much easier picking up the pieces, if and when the wall goes.
Victoria.
Vicky stirred in her sleep. The voice was faint, a faraway murmur on the very edge of her consciousness.
Victoria.
Vicky opened her eyes. Moonlight filled the bedroom. A slight breeze stirred the curtains, but otherwise all was still in the hot little room.
Are you happy with your hand?
Vicky sat up and stared around her. Where are you?
Water.
A picture of a lake formed in Vicky's mind. The image faded and then reappeared. Pentworth Lake.
Come to us.
Why? She asked. A strange compulsion urged her to move. She slipped from her bed and changed into a T-shirt, jeans and trainers. Once clear of the house, she set off at a fast pace down the lane and struck out over the fields. 15 minutes later, her hair slicked with perspiration, she emerged onto the road down to Pentworth Lake. It spread about below her, silver filigreed in the moonlight. It had shrunk to its normal size from the huge expanse of floodplain that had filled the valley in March. The margins were still soft underfoot, but no longer dangerous. The coolness of the water was a pleasant shock. Vicky stopped when it covered her ankles and stood still. "I'm here," she said, in a loud whisper. The response took Vicky by surprise. She was engulfed by a sudden sensation of warmth, welcoming, yet overpowering in its wordless intensity. "Who are you?"
Seekers.
"Where are you from?" The myriad of star patterns and constellations that Vicky saw confused her. She felt compunction to turn her head to the southeast. Sirius, the dog star, had just risen above the line of distant hills. "Is that where you've come from?" A picture of a brilliant sun shining on a landscape of forests and mountains came and went, leaving a lingering image that said,
Home.
"Is it far?" The distance that was expressed caused Vicky to cry out. The image was fleeting, snatched away as if those who projected it understood the distress it could cause. "Why have you come?" It was more than a sensation of loneliness that overwhelmed Vicky. It was utter desolation of the spirit.
We will be sending a man to you who will explain, but he is not yet ready.
"I don't understand."
We will call you when he is ready. You will understand then.
"Just what the hell do you think you're playing at?" Vicky whirled around and was blinded by a powerful flashlight. "It's Vicky Taylor," said another voice. It was the voice of the fool. The flashlight snapped out, and 2 Morris men confronted her. "What are you doing out at this time, Vicky?" asked the fool. "It was such a hot night. I thought I'd go for a swim." "You're coming with us," said one of the Morris men. "No," said the fool. "We'll run her home. I owe her a favour. Because of the barbecue smoke, I couldn't give her the cue to run at the carnival." The dawn chorus was in its stride when she reached her bedroom. She went to the window and looked out. Sirius was much dimmer now. She stared at the fading star in wonder. She looked down at her left hand. Why had they singled her out to make her whole?
She marshalled her powers of concentration and forced herself to think of one question.
"Please, I must know, did you make my hand? And will you take it away?"
Silence. She changed into her nightdress and returned to bed, the sheets and the pillow now blissfully cool. She prayed for an answer to the questions that were tormenting her. None came. But there was always tomorrow.
Nigel Anthony was reading Temple of the Winds by James Follett, the first book in the Silent Vulcan trilogy.